This is Polarized Light Microscopy in Archaeology, and this is Lecture 2.2, the example study for Old Basra in Iraq, very important pottery production center. Ooh. So, this is the map of all the sites, and it's a bit of an old map, so there are probably sites which are missing, but it's not bad. Here is Basra. As you can see, it's an Islamic production center. See, it's a kiln site. It's not where modern Basra is. And to find out why, I'll be telling you a lot about that in this lecture. So we're talking now about glazed pottery. This is the Islamic period. This is what I call a blue painted ware. For the obvious reason it is painted blue. See the blue? This is a cobalt blue paint applied as a glass over a white tin opacified glaze or tin glaze. And this technology seems to be put together at Basra. So this is probably a good time to have a refresher about glazes. So glazes are basically glass, which is mostly made of silica. The melting temperature of silica is higher than most kilns, certainly the kilns we have in the Middle East. And so it requires a flux to melt, rather like the salt I just threw on the ice outside my door. Now you can have an alkali flux, which contains 20 to 30% alkali elements such as soda and potash. And this mostly comes from plant ash sources, halophytic plants. In Egypt they have a source, a mineral source called natron, which they use. And that makes pottery looks a bit like this. And lead is another important Middle Eastern flux. 50 to 60% of lead comes from lead sulfide ores, like galena typically. And so that's what this is. And interestingly enough, they're both colored with the same element. They're both colored with copper. But what typically happens with an alkali glaze, it turns turquoise. But with a lead glaze, copper tends to turn green. So, before about 632, the political arrangement in the Middle East was that there was this Mediterranean-focused world and this plateau of Iran-focused world. And so we often call this the Empire of Persia. And this may be the Parthians in the earlier period, or the Sasanians just before in about 632, in fact. So this would be the Sasanian Empire, including Mesopotamia. And around the Mediterranean would be the Roman Empire, later the Byzantine Empire, who they really thought was just the Roman Empire. Later with a different capital, but so the Mediterranean world and the Persian world. So in the Roman world, there were major developments in glass production. Sidon in particular was a very well-known glass production center. And so lots of vitreous technologies were developed in the Levant. In fact, all major vitreous technologies we can discern seem to have been created first in this region, from up here down to around here. So this region, the Levant generally. Oop, my fingers are moving too fast today. Lead glazes were also found in the Roman world. Tarsus was an important production center, but it's thought those are also possibly made in other centers, possibly Aleppo or Antioch, Alexandria. Not enough is done in determining production centers for this stuff, partly because people tend to just find it as whole vessels, I think. I'm sure they're assured somewhere, but this is not the sort of thing that, say, I think like this is at the British Museum, that you'd want to go and cut a piece out of, you see. So it's hard to do provenance studies on it. Lead glazes, however, are also known in China, very important in China, at about the same time. And so it's possible that the knowledge of lead glaze was not isolated to the Mediterranean and to China, but was known in between. It's just we don't seem to have much of it within the Persian Empire. Maybe they were doing it up here or something. Who knows? And so the alkali glazed centers of Persia seem to be typically in Mesopotamia. Ctesiphon is thought to have been a major production center. Again, more work would be good to do on this, to thin section more pottery from Sasanian and Parthian times to see, certainly the glazed wares, if it's mostly made in one center, which we could possibly identify as Ctesiphon. But that's the hypothesis at the moment. So in 632, it was the beginning of a major change in the Middle East, with the development of Islam as a political entity. And so in 632, this was the extent as to the passing on of the Prophet Muhammad, blessings be upon him. His successors then expanded upon this. I've gone the wrong way. Going into basically the whole place. So initially they would have gone into Basra. I just use the word Basra at this stage because I'm going to be talking a lot more about it when we get further on. Kufa, around here. Damascus, the ancient capital of the Levant, of the Syrian province, Roman province. And Fustat, which, like Kufa and Basra, was originally a military camp. Basra in particular became immensely wealthy because this expansion into Iran was as a result of people from Basra. So the income from all of this land went back to Basra. Mesopotamia was the richest, one of the richest places in the world before then, son of the Sasanians, and all the resources of that area previously had gone to Ctesiphon, went to Kufa and Basra. Fustat was nowhere near as important as these centers at this stage. It became more important later on. It was just remained a relatively small settlement surrounded by mostly Coptic Christian Egyptians for a much longer time, whereas Arab-speaking peoples and Eastern Semitic peoples generally are far more common in this part of the world. So to have these Arab settlements flourish was very easy, whereas Damascus, of course, continued being a very cool place indeed. Oh, look, there it goes. Yeah, so they invaded the way up there and to there and out there and there. So, 100 years... Okay, so let's actually go back. So 661, this is Middle East. That all of this is covered. 100 years later, so places like Basra and Kufa were like the major centers of this part of the world. As important, if not more important in some cases, than the other centers. But then things changed with the foundation of Baghdad 100 years later, at 762. And this was by people who, the Abbasids, were a caliphal dynasty. The caliphs were the successors of the Prophet and ruled the Islamic world. At first, the only other people that ruled parts of the Islamic world would be other caliphal dynasties. At this stage, there was only another one in Spain, which we'll not talk about because they didn't make very nice pottery at that time. But the Abbasids were originally supported by this major settlement of Islamic people in Merv up here, supported by the wealth of one of the wealthiest parts of the world, which was Khorasan, which is this part of Iran, of Persia, shall we say. I mean, part of Khorasan is now in other countries and not in Iran at all. This is mostly because of the Mongols, which is a very different story. So, part of this story involves a technology introduced into pottery at this time known as lusterware, luster paint. And this is a lusterware. It's very nice. It's an overglaze technique, which I shall tell you more about. So in this, you have a piece of pottery. You have a nice piece of pottery which you've glazed and fired. So it's finished. It's a finished piece of pottery. And then on top of this glaze, on top of the glaze, which in this case is white, you put this paint, and we have a couple of treatises that talk about the contents, which include all sorts of sulfides, iron sulfides, and other materials. You can see it's quite a disgusting mixture of stuff. And if this whole paint fused to the surface of the glaze, it really wouldn't look very nice. The idea is that these elements, silver and copper, actually come out of the paint and fuse to the surface. Now this is a very difficult technique, because what you need is for the glaze to become sufficiently soft so that the silver and the copper come out of the paint and fuse to the surface. If the glaze doesn't become soft enough, it doesn't fuse to the surface. If the temperature is too high, all of this paint, all of this guck, basically fuses to the surface and it looks hideous. If any oxygen gets into the kiln, the silver and the copper will all leave with the oxygen and there'll be nothing on the surface. So it has to be under a reducing firing condition at a low temperature. So it's a special later firing, and it's very difficult. You need to have firm control over your glaze, because the glaze needs to soften at an appropriate temperature so you know what the hell's going on. So it's a very difficult technique, and I have found in my research that it is not made everywhere. That typically there's only one center at a time making it. That's not a strict rule, but that's pretty close to it. So after this firing, this stuff, the paint on the surface, the medium, shall we say, of the paint, can just be rubbed off with a cloth or something. You polish it up, and all you have left is the silver and the copper on the surface. So that you do this, and as one treatise writer called it, so that it shines like the sun, which is why I named a book after that. So you actually can't see luster paint through a scanning electron microscope, because it's very, very thin. It's like angstroms thin, molecules thin. But there are other things that you can see with a scanning electron microscope. It's very useful. You stick a sample in here, which is a ceramic sample, and you can do imaging using backscattered electrons, which get collected up here, and this is an image. The way this works is the backscattering, the intensity of it is based on the atomic number of the element that is being bombarded. And so this, which is tin, is white, whereas darker things, like this may be a feldspar or quartz, is dark. And so that's what we're seeing here. So, but you can see the things which are of the same element. Composition, elemental composition. Because it's not a single element, you know, this is tin oxide. And you can also have a probe, XRF analyzer, and you bombard the sample and collect X-rays, which are of a particular wavelength of the elements within it. So by doing this, you can like blast a little piece here to find out what the chemical composition is. And so this is a very useful technique. And of course, we use polarized light microscopy, which I hope you don't need an overview of, because, you know, we're like well into the course by now. So I think I went forward to there you go. So here, this is the Tigris-Euphrates basin. If you don't recognize it, here is the Euphrates, and here's the Tigris. I always remember which one's which, because Euphrates is longer than the Tigris, and the word is longer. So that's how I remember. So we have some contemporary textual evidence for pottery production centers in this part of the world. Al-Yaqubi talks about potters from Kufa, which is the pre-existing, Hira is a pre-existing city in this area, and Kufa is basically right next to it. Kufa was the Islamic settlement. From Kufa and Basra were brought to Samarra. Samarra was a major palace center founded in the early 9th century. And so they needed people to make, I guess, pottery and certainly tiles, or possibly tiles. And so they brought potters from here to found this important new settlement. Al-Jahiz describes vessels. Al-Jahiz actually comes from Basra, so he knows who he's talking about, whose body color seems as if it had been molded out of an egg yolk. So it's very distinctive, he thought, the body, the ceramic body of Basran pottery, which is very interesting because, of course, this is basically, he's doing paste studies 1,000 years ago. And so he's saying the Basra paste is very distinct from the other fabrics that is seen in his part of the world, which is very interesting and also very true. Some later, so these guys were in the 8th century, 9th century. These are slightly later, and they talk about Baghdad, that Baghdad was made pottery, which is reasonable. And we also have a couple of vessels which have inscriptions on them saying where they were made. This one was the work of Ibrahim al-Nasrani that was been made in Hira. So Hira is next to Kufa, as you saw on the map. And this one was made in Basra by Yahya bin Umayyah. It's very nice. One of the interesting things about this is that it is clearly lead glazed. But the motifs on it actually look quite pre-Islamic. But yeah, so very nice. Basra. So we also have archaeological evidence. We have these wasters, which were found, I would say, by a reliable source. Some oil man was wandering around by the oil fields there, and he found these. He wasn't a dealer trying to sell a line, and he went to talk to the curator at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and he said, I found these things, what do you think? And he, of course, recognized them as being wasters. Well, some of these are wasters. This is a waster, this is a waster. This is kiln furniture, and this would originally have been sticking in the side of the kiln so that you could lay the pottery on it when you were firing it on them, because you can't stack glazed pottery because in the kiln, because when you stack it, the glaze turns into a fluid and then hardens when you fire it. And so it would all fuse together, which is a really bad thing. And so you just want to have it just sort of sitting lightly on something which you can remove. This here, see this scar and the glaze here, would be from resting on one of these. And so you can see this has been removed from resting on some of these rod-shaped kiln furniture things. And this is blue glass, which I would assume, since it's a pottery production center, and it may be that it's actually glass for making glass, but it could be for coloring pottery, painting pottery. So this is evidence for production at Basra. So when we thin section evidence for production, we are characterizing production at that site, which is very useful. So the association with this fabric to Basra is 100% certain. What we need to do then is make sure we can also associate it with every other site in the Tigris-Euphrates basin. So that is actually one of the reasons I studied all this pre-Islamic pottery. As I told you in the previous class, we have a major field project in this part of the world, so I was working on this for that reason, and I had a colleague working on Tel Hadidi who wanted to do petrographic analysis, and so we did some pottery from Tel Hadidi. But the rest of these pre-Islamic sites I sampled in order to just have a look what they look like, so I could create a model for the Tigris-Euphrates basin, because as you have seen, there seemed to be limited evidence for the number of production centers. We had evidence for Basra, for Hira or Kufa area, for Baghdad itself, for Samarra. We also had evidence for Araka up in Syria here, which was also briefly a major caliphal palace center, and probably had potters brought from other production centers, and where there have been excavations where they have found the kilns and found the wasters, and it's all very good. And so we know what this looks like as well. Although, of course, this isn't mentioned anywhere, so, you know, you can't rely on history. But if we take as an assumption that, yes, these are the major production centers, we should only be looking for 4 major fabrics. And from research on major sites, Samarra itself was a site I did a lot of analysis of. But pottery from Iraq, from this period of the 8th, 9th, 10th century AD, or of the Common Era, or the Christian reckoning, depending which way you want to count it, tended to be of one of 4 fabrics. One was the Basra fabric, one was more suitable to this area, and of course I also studied the Chalcolithic pottery of Samarra. One from probably around here, which is probably Baghdad, and one which was like further down, more like the or Tal al-Ubaid, Nippur sort of area, which I thought probably this must be Kufa. So that's why this fabric, and I'm afraid this is a very old photograph, I'm actually I've been working for the past couple of years at getting new microscopes with better photographs, and when I get those, I'm probably going to go absolutely crazy posting new photographs of all my petrofabrics. But in the meantime, you'll just have to believe me that this is that Baghdad fabric. This is actually a slip made of crushed quartz, and this is the lead glaze. And this is another manky old photograph. This is the Basra petrofabric, and it's quite fine. It's hardly any inclusions in it, which you might say if you were like ignorant enough to just look at a little area here through a scanning microscope where you have an inconsequential sample size for doing petrographic analysis, you might think, oh, well, this lacks characterization, so therefore it has no characters. But in fact, the absence of characteristics is also a characteristic when every other production center has a lot of stuff in it. And so the fact that this is from a sediment, from a inclusion deprived sediment, is actually evidence. And the fact that you do get the occasional thing, and it has Aeolian sand in it from the desert, far too often for it to just be the occasional wind-blown thing. There is naturally in the sediment wind-blown sand. You can see it's a well-rounded, typically quartz, occasionally feldspar. And so this hasn't been levigated to look like this because there wouldn't be anything in it other than very fine sand. This is a very fine deposit of clay. There is sufficient aplastics of a very fine size to make it a nice enough pottery fabric, and it has these on it as well. So they really lucked out with the clay here, and so they started making pottery, and it was all good. So most of the rest of this lecture is basically telling you about this. This is the Wadi Batin, which is not much of a river now, but in the last ice age, this was a major river draining the highlands over here and flooding down to the Tigris-Euphrates basin. So now you don't think of it being much, but this actually would have been in the last ice age. And don't forget from the last lecture that this is very shallow. This is actually a single basin, and that happens to be where the sea level is at the moment. And so during the last ice age, there would have been more water, or less at the time. And so there would have been a major delta here when the water was up in here. And there have been times when water came up as far as or Tel Al Ubaid from the sea, that this would have been a delta that looks a bit like, you can imagine what the, which we don't have on the image here, the Nile Delta. And so this is the sediment from the Wadi Batin. In the post-Pleistocene period, of course, when all this area has become arid, it is a seasonal stream, but what it also is a gravel bed from it being an ancient river. And so this is a perfect place for people from this part of the world to travel to this part of the world. And so that's why when the armies of Islam came out of this part of the world and came down, this was one of the first places they arrived. They created a big fort, and from there conquered the rest of this part of the world. Also came up this way, of course, but that's part of why Basra is where it is. So this is the area of Basra. This is modern Basra, which in pre-Islamic times was known as Abullah. This is the town of Azubair, which is here, which is actually the site of Basra when it was founded. These are some marshes. This is actually from a map from the 70s of areas that could be flooded. May have been more than this in ancient times, of course. This is the Wadi Batin. This is from a geological map. And so this is where the Wadi Batin sediments went to. This is now, we're zooming in a bit. So here's Azubair, here's Abullah. So this is thought to be from medieval Basra, from Old Basra. This is one of what would have documentary evidence that there were 4 major mosques in Basra. And this probably would have been one of them, certainly one of them, because it's of the right period and it's pretty big. This is just one corner. It would have been a big open mosque with these big tall towers in each corner. And so this is evidence for where Basra was. It was said to be about 3 miles at its narrowest and much wider in the other direction. I have put it here. What this white circle is here, I shall get to. So this is the town of Azubair, and this actually grew up around a pilgrimage site, which was the grave of a man called Zubair. And so that's why this town is here. But this is where Old Basra was, or part of it. Old Basra is actually a much bigger town. This is a 1940 map, which helpfully shows the street patterns at the time. It's a bit clearer than looking at the Google image is. But if you apply that to the town, you can see it's actually quite an orthogonal pattern. It doesn't, typically when you have street patterns that start from a single pilgrimage site, and we have lots of examples of that, you will start off with a pilgrimage site, say it's here, and all the streets will radiate from it. This looks like someone's organized it. The question is when. And interestingly, the street pattern aligns with the street that goes right past that mosque. Now this street ends right here, right there. And interestingly, this is where the cemetery is. Now the cemeteries are always outside of cities, and this happens in Europe, and it especially happens in the Middle East, where it is required that if you have dead people, you go outside the city and bury them there. And so this is the cemetery of Azubair, but you can see it's actually huge compared to, it's almost like half of the size of the settlement. And I actually have some other city maps later on showing you that this is huge for this. And I think this is actually the cemetery of Old So this would have to be outside the city. and the radiating streets going out this way into the cemetery would suggest that somewhere around here would have been the gate. And this would be about where the wall is, along the same alignment as these streets. So that is the beginning of my reconstruction of Basra and where it is. So here's that street going up to the desert gate. And zooming out a bit, so there's other lines of evidence. Here's another old map. Old maps are very useful because it's very difficult to get new maps which are as good. And so in 1942 we had very good surveyors going around with theodolites, making actual measurements of things and taking records of where things were. And this shows the actual contours, which is useful, so we can actually work out the altitude. And also things like that there is an escarpment goes around here. So let's put that escarpment and those contours on this map. And so you can see that if Basra is around here, this is actually much higher than the floodplain at 10 feet. So the contours of that old map, so about 3 meter contours. So this is about 3 meters, which are quite high above sea level. 9, 10 meters and 12, 13 meters. So this is actually a ridge overlooking the Tigris-Euphrates basin. And you can imagine all of this is completely flat. And so when you come out of the desert and here you are, this would have been a great view to see all the land that you plan to conquer. And so it would be very reasonable to then say, let's make a city here. Let's make a nice big camp and make this our base of operations. And it became a big base of operations and also became the home of the army for many years afterwards. Within this area, there's actually been excavations, which are not well reported. They seem to be done by local archaeologists officially, but not well published. But you can see them from Google Earth. And another interesting thing you can see are these linear features in the plain, on the floodplain below Basra. Unless it's been snowing, and snows regularly in this part of the world, which it isn't, this is almost certainly salt. And the linear features are almost certainly irrigation channels. The land, the plain below, the floodplain below Basra was renowned as being a beautiful garden of canals and date trees. And its beauty was a thing of legend and song. And now it's horrifying. It's just this salt desert. Because the problem with irrigation is it's wonderful. At first you dig all these ditches and irrigate all this land, but when all this land comes and with the high evaporation, it tends to leave salt behind it. The water will leave salt behind it. So eventually the land dies because of all the salt. And that's what happened to this land. Once with enough resources, it became a beautiful garden, but then it died because it's just a natural consequence of doing that. So that's probably one of the reasons why Old Basra became a less good idea of a place to live. So this shows you some of those linear features. You can see there's a lot of them. I just sort of copied some of them to get the orientation. You can see there is a couple of major ones. This seemed to be a major one. You can see the angle of these canals change here. So this clearly was a significant canal. And there seemed to be another one here, which is where the modern road between Azubair and modern Basra is. And there is accounts of two major canals, the Nile Delta, which go into a bulla here, so that one, and the Nile Makil, which went up towards Baghdad, And that's probably that one there. So also, and once I started doing all this research and telling people about it, some other people who have actually been trying to excavate in Basra and having problems with doing that under the pandemic, shared with me this wonderful aerial photograph they had from the 60s, which actually showed earthworks, the actual walls. So this is that wall. And so that is Basra in the 7th and to 10th century. And so this is the city we're talking about. This is a very important city throughout this time. As I was saying, it was founded as basically a fortress to conquer this part of the world, but it's basically where that army continued to live after the conquest. And the resources, the abundant wealth of Mesopotamia would have all poured into this settlement and also into Kufa. When this army then conquered most of Iran, especially the wealthy province of Khorasan, that wealth would have then been pouring into Basra as well. And so this would have been one of the wealthiest parts of the world right here in this town, this city. So it would have been very important. This would have been where potters would want to go. So if you could imagine, if there was a major production center at Ctesiphon in 632, now potters have to feed their families. And you often think, oh, well, you know, it's in between times and they can, I don't know, go and do something else. But potters have to pot. It's what they do. They're good at it, and they need to find somewhere where they can make pottery. So they will need to find a market. And so at some stage, they would have gone to these major centers and started making pottery. And so the pottery production at Basra probably started very, very soon after the foundation of the city, because potters got a pot, and people got to use pottery, and why bother bringing it all the way over when, in fact, they have quite nice clay at Basra, as it turned out. And so I'm sure they started making pottery very early after the foundation of the city in the 630s. Now, the thing about pottery production is it's really stinky. It tends not to be as stinky as this, because these are all coal-fired kilns. But you can see that this is, if you have pottery production, you want this to be downwind of where you live. And here's another one. But again, as I said, this is all coal-fired pottery production. So typically, when we find pottery production centers, actual evidence of pottery production, it is downwind of any Middle Eastern city. This is Damascus, and here is the medieval city. Here are the cemeteries, and you can see they're much smaller than the city itself. This is a windrose, and it tells you that the wind blows. Windrose, yes, I told them that. It blows in this direction. And so, of course, where you want to make pottery is over here, and that's where we have found evidence for production at Damascus. This is Cairo. This is Cairo. This is like all of the occupation of medieval Cairo. This was the original Fustat was down here. It spread up here. Then in the late 10th century, Cairo itself, Al-Qahira, was founded up here, and everything just filled in after that. But in the south, it started to be not occupied. It's thought that possibly after the Crusaders burnt down Fustat, that it wasn't actually occupied much. And so we find in the 14th and 15th centuries, when most people actually lived up here, this is when we find evidence for pottery production in Fustat. We don't find evidence for pottery production at Fustat in the main area of Fustat during the early period of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries when it was a major center. We find it there much later when it was probably abandoned. And so this, again, is downwind of where most people were living at the time. In fact, since I said that, and I've been saying to people, if we want to find production of when Fustat was an important pottery production center, we need to look south of the city. And since I started saying that, someone actually published results of excavation where they actually found some wasters here, and somebody has told me personally that they found other pottery around here, south of the city. Around here, actually. And so, yeah, south of the city, because the wind says so. Here's Raqqa, as I told you, we have found, or they have been found, I wasn't actually there at the time, pottery production centers. And they're up here, and the wind goes this way. Raqqa, this is the later bit. This is the early bit, but they were both occupied. And so, since the wind direction goes this way, I would expect that what we want to look for, pottery production centers, will be south, somewhere south of the city. So, using, again, Google Earth, I've been looking for these pottery production centers, looking for any line of evidence. What I found were holes in the ground. So these are just outside the gates, probably, and there are probably other gates, of Fustat, which is quite reasonable. If you're making pottery for Fustat, you want to make pottery for it. So this may in fact be where those wasters were found, is in this area. So these are just big holes in the ground, and so you're probably thinking, how does a big hole in the ground make a pottery production center? Well, the clay has to come from somewhere. So, of course, it's possible that what was dug out of this hole in the ground was used for other purposes. For instance, the walls are made of mud bricks. So, yes, there are lots of reasons to make holes in the ground to get clay. But this is exactly what a pottery production center's clay resource looks like. This is a less old clay pit from the town of Hais in the Yemen, where I've actually been, because they're still making pottery from this area now. They didn't make pottery here 1,000 years ago. They were making pottery here, I think, from the 13th century onwards, and they're still using it to extract pottery now. So this is what a hole for pottery looks like. So it's a hypothesis that these pits are for this reason. And so those, I showed you the ones which were near the town, but looking over this entire area, I could only find these pits in this direction. And so, you know, you don't need necessarily to make clay pits for baked bricks downwind of the city. Baked bricks, you can bake them anywhere, just lay them out in the sun. So that would suggest to me that if they're digging this out for a clay resource, they're firing it, and so it's downwind. So it could be, and there's lots of holes here. So this may explain something I find in the petrography, because certain types of pottery, like all of the lusterwares and all of those blue painted wares, have the same petrofabric, the same petrographically defined fabric. So it would suggest to me that they are from the same workshop. Probably one of these next to the city. Not necessarily, but probably, just because, you know, why not? But in these turquoise glazed jars, and there was a lot of heavier vessels, heavier bowls, preparation vessels, and these big storage vessels were made of fabrics that included indistinguishable, shall we say, from the fabric found in the lusterwares and the blue painted wares, but a bunch of other fabrics which were slightly different, sufficiently different I can say this is different. I don't know how different, I don't know why different, but it's different. Not as different as the other major production centers, attributed to, say, Kufa, not as different as some of those other pre-Islamic sites I've done from not very far away, but sufficiently different. And so it might be that the turquoise pottery production centers were in a number of these other places. And a lot of these big jars are thought to have been for date paste, which was traded around the whole world. You find these in China, in fact, and in fragments of these jars have been found in South Africa and in Scandinavia. So these get around, and whether it's because they are kind of cool, or maybe it's because of the wonderful date paste that's found inside them. But don't forget, all this area underneath here was a date plantation. So this would be a good place to make pottery for putting date paste in. So I vaguely talked about dating. So I have been using dating on this pottery as well, using seriation. Seriation is a technique first invented by an archaeologist, Flinders Petrie. You probably see a lot of photographs of Flinders Petrie with a big white beard. This is, he looked a bit more like this when he wrote his seminal paper on seriation, sequences in prehistoric remains. So what he did was he had assemblages in these tombs. And so what he did was he would put little drawings on strips of paper and then arrange them, because he had this idea that it's possible that some types of pottery will be found in more than one, and other types of pottery might be found in this one and that one. So he must have thought, I wonder if this creates a sequence. And he found that it does. That one type of pottery will go into another tomb or another period, but other ones will die out. And so he was able to put all these strips of paper with drawings on them in order. And this is actually a real thing. This is actually what happens. Pottery is made, they make it for a while, they stop making it. But they're making other pottery, and this is made. And so these sequences will go through time and change. The one thing seriation can't tell you is which way up it is. It might be that's going the other way around and pottery is coming in and going out. But it is, if you get any dating evidence at all, then you can decide which way up your seriation sequence is. So I did this seriation thing on motifs found on the pottery. And this is just examples of motifs. There's actually more than one. But again, you can see that they come into, if you associate them, and again, you're also looking at forms. So it seems the forms are also associated with phases in which you get some, but not all, of these motifs. And so by doing that, I was able to create what appeared to be a sequence. Like this one is distinctive of that one. This one, see, here's some of that one. This is actually a lusterware. These early wares, it seems only the early ones are found on blue painted wares. The lusterwares would come in later. This one is found here is on a blue painted ware, and this is only found on lusterwares. So there's also some dating evidence. Some of it is wobbly. Some of it is more wobbly than other lines of evidence. But you slap them on here, and you can start saying like this material, which the archaeologists thought was from after 700 or maybe before. This is this group. So this first phase is only found at Susa. So we're saying it's made at Basra because I have thin sectioned some of this stuff. And also I found one sample at Bahrain. And so I can see in this first period, they are only making pottery for themselves. Susa was basically occupied by people from Basra. Bahrain was a politically important center, so it's possible that they might want to send them a few nice bits of pottery. But since all the wealth of this whole area was in Basra at this time, they would have no reason to make pottery that wouldn't anywhere else. They would have just made pottery for themselves, not for themselves, but for the large market that existed within the city of Basra itself. Now, the glazes are very odd. So this is the body of this first phase, as I'm calling it. And this is tin. And the tin is mostly found on the interface between the clay and the glaze. This is the glaze. And also in the glaze, you find all this other stuff. You find lots of bubbles, and you find other inclusions, like quartz, and you find other crystals, other silicate crystals. Now, this is actually, if you remember the pictures of pre-Islamic white glazed pottery, this is how they would be white. They wouldn't have tin in it. They would have quartz. They would have silicate crystals, which had grown in the glassy matrix, that would be semi-opaque. It would be opaque because of some of these other inclusions, and that would make a white glaze. So this white glaze is actually still related to those pre-Islamic white glazes, but they've added tin. Other people have told me, since I first published this, that you get tin on the surface when you don't add very much tin. So from somewhere they've got the idea that you can make an opaque white glaze by adding tin, and so they've added some, but they haven't added enough. So then we have phase 2, and Hira, have pottery from Hira, which can be datable, and this is what that glaze looks like. So here again you can see the pottery, and here you can see there's tin. So now they've added more tin, so there's tin all over the glaze, but still you can see that there are other silicate crystals growing, there's other inclusions, and so this is still a continuation of the pre-Islamic alkali glaze technology, but with more tin in it. So it's like the next phase, which really works with the phasing, of course. In this phase, it is found more widely, again with politically important centers, like at the Hira here, which is related to the major production center at Kufa, and the major political center at Kufa, the palace city of Samarra, which is, also a nice place to find pottery. Nishapur is also a very important city, again within the Basra-controlled area, as was Istakhr here. And so within these politically important areas, you might get some of this pottery. The trade network is widening, but it's not found everywhere. It's not found in every little port city around the world. So then we continue. This is an important style from this this mosque in Kairouan in Tunisia, has tiles that look exactly like this. This is actually later pottery from Susa, but it's got exactly the same motifs and style on it, and it's made in Basra. And then we have the later material here, which we basically consider to be 10th century, but dating before they started making lusterwares in Egypt under the Fatimid dynasty, which is about here. And we have a number of lines of dating evidence for that, which I'll talk about, because I'm going to talk about Fatimid lusterwares as well in a later lecture. So that is how we can more or less put some numbers on the sequence. This seems to be like a little sequence, so this only gets 25 years. And of course, it's kind of bogus. These are like 50-year periods on the Christian calendar. So it's not really that real, but it's as real as you're going to get. But as I think, Basra was founded in the 630s, officially founded in 638, but the camp would have been there from about 5 years earlier, and probably there would have been a known encampment there from even earlier than that. So quite soon after the conquest of Mesopotamia, those potters from Ctesiphon or wherever they were making glazewares, would have been looking for somewhere to make pottery where the market was. And so they would have been making some pottery, very likely some glazed pottery, from much earlier. I mean, you think 638, early 700, that's a lot of time for potters to not actually be feeding their families. And so there are undoubtedly potters, there are undoubtedly glazeware potters, and they were making pottery. So it's possible that 700 is in fact much earlier. And we could possibly stretch this into an earlier period, and there may even be predecessors, white glazes, possibly with no tin at all, from possibly only found at Basra, which is why it would be really nice to have some major excavations there. Because why would they trade it with anybody else when all the money's in Basra? So, and we have Baghdad founded, and that sort of thing. So, some other interesting things that happen, which I also like to talk about to annoy people, is that there are a number of unpleasant things that happened. This is 871, the Zanj Rebellion as it's known, and in this period the Zanj were slaves that worked on the date plantations, and they started a revolt. They were a big threat to the establishment in Baghdad, but they were eventually defeated. But in the meantime, according to the historical records, they sacked Basra and killed everybody. But according to the records, they killed everybody except for the Shia. Now, what is a Shia? Well, if you know anything about Islam, you'll know that there is this division between the Sunni and the Shia, and this happens to this day. The difference between a Sunni and a Shia in the 9th century and today is not necessarily the same thing, so don't go necessarily thinking it's exactly the same. But what it basically means is the Shia, the term Shia, it means party. It was originally the Shiite Ali. Ali was the son-in-law of the Prophet. He was from the Prophet's family. And so at that time, the Shia were basically people who thought the successor of the Prophet should come from the Prophet's family. That was the initial cause for them to exist. Whereas the Sunni didn't think that. That any decent person, originally from the followers of the Prophet, but after that, they had to work out better ways of doing things, or other ways of doing things, I don't say it's necessarily better. And so this was a political schism at first, more than anything else. But the Zanj were Shia, and apparently they killed everybody in Basra except for Shia people. The Karmatians did the same in 923. They actually come from the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, depending which side of it you're standing on. And they, like the Gulf coast of Saudi Arabia, Karmati were very zealous Shia, and they also became problematic for the authorities in Baghdad. They came up in 923 and sacked Basra and killed everybody except for the Shia. So either this is just complete nonsense and they didn't sack everybody, kill everybody, or that since we have some evidence to suggest that pottery was merely being made all this time, that these potters were actually Shia. And we'll get back to this in later, because there's actually later evidence that they were Shia as well. Then another interesting thing is we have the Boyids. The Boyids were a Persian dynasty from Iran, and they were also Shia, and they conquered, and they became, you can see that this green, so these are caliphs. The Boyids weren't caliphs, they were just running the shop, and they carried on having an Abbasid caliph. And so for a while they were running things. And it's interesting that it's at this time we get figural imagery on the Basra pottery. So it's not really figural. It's kind of weird looking. It's always kind of weird looking. But here we have figures on pottery made at Basra, Islamic pottery with figures on. And this is actually, for these major centers, the first time we see that. So, which is very interesting because the Boyds in particular, who were Shia, were very tolerant of, shall we say, non-Islamic influences. They were more Persian nationalists as anything else, and called themselves Shahs and things like that. So here we have possibly the political or religious influence on what they're putting on pottery. So after that initial first narrow distribution of the pottery, pottery from Basra went everywhere. When all the money started going to Baghdad, when Basra needed to rely on other sources of money rather than just revenues from conquered areas, the potters made pottery to trade. Sometimes jars with trade materials in it, or it was probably trading the luster wares and blue painted wares themselves because they were pretty. And so pottery from Basra covers the entire Old World. And I have sampled pottery from South Africa and from Thailand, and there's pottery which must be of that type from Japan and China. I have sampled pottery from Central Asia. Pottery's been found in Scandinavia, and I've sampled it from Corinth and many other parts of the world. So it really, really got around. And the port aspect of Basra became increasingly important because of trade. And so eventually, once the date plantations probably failed because of the salination, Basra eventually became the port right on the river there, where Abulla had always been, and that became Basra. And Old Basra was forgotten and deserted, and became another town entirely. So that's the story of Basra. Thank you.